Today we are going to do our follow-up to the 1960s at home, which is to cover the Vietnam War, which in one way or another goes from the mid-1950s up through the mid-1970s, with the majority of the fighting going on between about 1965 and 1973. This is kind of a tricky one to do, is before we got to the Vietnam War, it had been basically an uninterrupted stream of American victories since really the War of 1812 ended. And if you want to go back further, I guess you could say the Revolution is the War of 1812 is not great, but it's not an absolute disaster either. Vietnam is going to change all of that and really sort of influence the way that America is going to deal with everything overseas afterwards. I mean, up through today, really. I cut out some of the more, let's say, disturbing imagery in this. I'll explain what happened in a number of events, but I'm not going to show the pictures of it just because I'm not here to contextualize it for you in person and answer questions. As always, if you have questions, hit me up on Remind or email me or talk to me during office hours. Vietnam is sort of America's first war that we are aware of at all times. And as a result of that, it's going to change the way America really views the war. So let's get started. This first slide here is largely backstory. I've tried to distill it down as much as I can, but it is sort of confusing for why America is getting involved in Vietnam. We had allies in South Korea. South Vietnam does not hold the same sort of assets that South Korea did. They do not have a booming economy. They're not getting around to doing anything particularly special. They're not particularly helpful. And all they really have going for them is they're near China. We won't go into this too much, but Vietnam has a history going back literally millennia of them fighting back against the Chinese. So the Vietnamese don't really like the Chinese. But America's not super aware of that fact. And also, we don't really care. So here we go. Vietnam, as well as parts of Thailand, Laos, and Cambodia, all of which you can see on the map here, were under the control in an area of France, in an area called French Indochina. And they had a bunch of rubber plantations, was sort of the big thing going for them, and they were a French colony, even following World War II, when most colonies were sort of split up and allowed to become their own countries. France sticks around in Vietnam and thinks that they've got everything under control, but in 1954 they're going to lose a battle way up here in a valley in the middle of nowhere called Dien Bien Phu. And there, the numerically inferior but technologically superior French colonial troops are going to get absolutely smashed by the North Vietnamese, with the world kind of watching. Is there regular reports on what's going on here, and everybody thinks, well, the French, have better technology. A number of these guys are veterans of World War II. They'll be fine against a bunch of what they perceive as just sort of dirt farmers that live in North Vietnam that don't want them there anymore. And instead, what is going to happen is the will of the Vietnamese people is going to be shown, and it is a strong will, and this is sort of the beginning of the Vietnam War of Independence. We often don't look at it that way, but that's really kind of what it's viewed as by the Vietnamese, be they communist or not communist, that this is the start of pushing Europeans out of Vietnam. The Vietnamese are fighting under the leadership of a guy named Ho Chi Minh. He is not a general, he's a political leader. He's educated in possibly Moscow, definitely Paris. He's an avowed communist. He wants to make the entire country communist. But so far, he's really only succeeded in convincing the people in northern Vietnam, the orange on your map on the right there, to play along with him. But under Ho Chi Minh's guidance, France is soundly defeated at the Battle of Dien Bien Phu, and the Chinese have a strong foothold in North Vietnam. France decides to bail soon afterwards. So that's 54-55. But the U.S. is there. And the U.S., as we've established in previous chapters, views itself as the guardian of Republican democracy around the world. We are the bulwark against communism. We're going to stop communism from spreading. Remember, we had containment theory before, is we got to keep containment there. Now, we're going to go a step further. We're going to say if we can't contain it, if we can't contain, just North Korea up there, then domino theory is going to happen. And this is sort of the next step in the U.S. fighting against communism. And what domino theory says is that if one country falls to communism, or even if part of that country falls to communism, so if North Vietnam falls to communism here, then surrounding nations will follow. It will be like tipping over dominoes. So if North Vietnam falls, then South Vietnam falls. If all of Vietnam falls, then Laos and Cambodia fall. Then Thailand falls if we were to go further on the map over here. Then Burma falls. Then India falls. If India falls, then Iran falls. If Iran falls, then the rest of the Middle East falls. And then all of a sudden, all of Asia is controlled by the communists, and we can't allow that to happen. So, under President Dwight Eisenhower, who is a firm believer in domino theory, he is going to decide to send over U.S. military to train up the South Vietnamese military. They're often referred to as ARVN, ARVN. You'll see that on these slides a bunch, but ARVN is the South Vietnamese military. And these advisors are just there to train. They're basically there. This is one of them right here. This is a Green Beret sent in by President Kennedy in 1961. They're sent in there to make sure that the ARVN troops are well enough equipped and trained that they can fight back against the inferior equipped North Vietnamese communists. So on paper, that seems like it should work. Eisenhower leaves after his second term, and JFK doubles down on this in early 1961. So soon after he's elected, he says, dang, Eisenhower, you were right. We need to send in more advisors because the North Vietnamese are creeping down into South Vietnam. They're creeping along what's called the Ho Chi Minh Trail, which we'll talk about in a little bit, but basically the communists have access to large parts of Vietnam. It's not like there is a dam here that is stopping communists from getting through. They're just sort of sneaking in and spreading that communist ideology in the South. And Kennedy says, well, the best way to combat this is to make sure that the South Vietnamese army, ARVN, is ready to fight back. It doesn't really work because the U.S. troops that are sent in are the best of the best. They are trained. They are adamant that they are fighting against communism. They know what they're doing. Here's the problem, and this will dog the United States for the entirety of the war. ARVN troops and officers are terrible. They are not loyal to the country. They don't like the South Vietnamese government. They regularly steal the officers who are in charge of paying the men, often pocket the money. The men are never paid. As a result, there are regular desertions. People skip training when they don't feel like it. People show up drunk for duty regularly or just don't show up at all. And the thought among the South Vietnamese army is basically like, hey, the Americans won't let us lose. That domino theory says that they can't let us lose. So we can just let the Americans fight for us. And as a result, the North Vietnamese, despite the fact they don't really have a lot of training, they have, occasional military folks coming down from China or coming in from Russia to give them some tips. But for the most part, they're self-taught farmers that are fighting for their freedom. And the South Vietnamese soldiers basically think, yeah, well, the U.S. can handle that. They'll be fine on their own. And as a result, they're going to be a liability in combat. American troops will never really be able to rely on most ARVN troops to help them fight against the North Vietnamese. This will be a major problem going forward. We'll refer to the North Vietnamese as the NVA or the Viet Cong. The NVA are the North Vietnamese army, and the Viet Cong are sort of a guerrilla force. We'll talk about them on, I believe, the next slide. So, the military in South Vietnam is not up to snuff, nor will they ever be. On top of that, the U.S. has endorsed a guy by the name of Nguyen Do Diem. It's right here. Pronouncing Korean or Vietnamese words is hard. We'll muddle through it. But he's the president of South Vietnam. He is corrupt. His family is corrupt. They are abusive. Nobody really likes them. And many, including advisors to President Eisenhower and Kennedy, are always like, we should get this guy out of there because he's ruining this for everybody, including us. As if we keep backing up this guy who's clearly being abusive to his people, what good is that doing them? And if we keep him in charge, all that's happening is Diem is essentially a giant poster boy for here's why North Vietnam is better. People like Ho Chi Minh up there. He's a communist. He's a very hardcore communist. But on the other hand, He and his family aren't bleeding the country dry and stealing all of our money and hiding it in offshore bank accounts. Um, and as a result, even the US is like, he sucks, but at least he's not a communist. But the rest of the world looks at it and is like, yeah, no, he sucks, full stop. We can't let Diem stay in charge. A number of protests, largely led by Buddhist monks, are going to start demonstrating in southern cities, especially Saigon, down here, the capital. And this is a picture of the event before it happens. You can see this monk sitting here. He's having a can of gasoline poured on him. He is going to be one of a couple of monks in South Vietnam to self-immolate or light himself on fire and kill himself in protest of the South Vietnamese government of President Diem. It's a very famous picture. Again, that's one of those things I told you we'll talk about it, but I'm not going to show it here. This is startling. Kind of like you guys saw in the civil rights stuff, this is one of those things where if it's abstracted and it's read about, if you just read about what's happening, in protests in Selma, that's one thing. But if you see the violence and the carnage that is happening as a result of this protest, it means a lot more. So when these pictures make it over to the United States, everybody says, whoa, we thought we were backing the right guy. But if you have holy men murdering or killing themselves willingly to protest against this government, not even trying to overthrow the government, just say, hey, you're doing a terrible job here, you need to leave, that makes a major impact. This will also make a major impact on a number of Buddhists that live all throughout South Vietnam and non-Buddhists as well. There are a bunch of Christians in South Vietnam, including the Diems, which is one of the reasons they're unpopular, is that the people who subscribe to the more local religions as opposed to the imported religions of the French don't really like the way the Diems are dealing with stuff. In 1963, about a month before Kennedy's assassinated, Diem is assassinated. There's some questions as to, was the U.S. aware of this? Maybe. But a military junta is going to be put in charge. It's basically going to be a rotating cast of South Vietnamese generals who are all kind of like we see up here, super corrupt, not particularly trustworthy. None of them are going to stay in charge for a super long time. But like it says down there, it's a sunk cost at this point. We have been committed to stopping the domino of South Vietnam from falling for, as you can see, almost a decade here, 8-9 years. And the U.S. can't pull out because we believe that would show the Chinese and the Russians that we're weak, and that if they put enough pressure on countries near them, that the U.S. won't stick around in the long term to fight them off. So, John F. Kennedy is killed. Enter Lyndon Johnson. And this is where things are going to go from sort of sketchy but manageable to out of control. Because at this point, the Viet Cong, who are the guerrilla military of North Vietnam, so these are your farmers. They look like this. They're using decades-old weapons. They're basically outfitted in sandals and black pajamas is usually how it's referred to. They survive off a handful of rice a day. To use an analogy that'll probably bother some people here, these are the farmers of the American Revolution fighting against the professional British troops. It's the same sort of thing going on here, except they're communists. And they also blend in with the populace. And as I said on that last slide, is a number of civilians in South Vietnam think that, hey, the communists can't be any worse than this Diem guy, let's give him a shot. And throughout the war, the Viet Cong will be sheltered in many places in South Vietnam by people that want to see the South Vietnamese government and all its corruption fall. This will cause a major problem for U.S. troops fighting the entire war, because not only is the land that they're fighting on hostile to them with these jungles and these rice paddies and the heat and the disease and the malaria and all of that, but they're afraid of the people themselves, because now you're not fighting against just the NVA who are wearing military uniforms. You're fighting against anybody in the civilian population. Men, women, children could all be members of the Viet Cong and sneak down and fight in South Vietnam, be it in major military operations or sneak attacks, bombings of diners, that sort of stuff. All that can happen at the hands of the Viet Cong. As a result, the tension that American soldiers are going to experience during this war is far more than we've really seen anywhere else in American history. So, escalation. How does the war escalate? The war escalates after something called the Gulf of Tonkin incident that happens in mid 1964. Um, Tensions have been escalating with the North Vietnamese for a while. We've been flying over Hanoi, which is the capital of North Vietnam. We've been bombing it, and we've had ships off the coast in international waters. And after a series of sort of close brushes between U.S. ships and North Vietnamese torpedo boats, one night a U.S. ship alleges that North Vietnamese ships fired at it, and it turns out years later that that was not the case, and there were no ships really in the area. And there's two interpretations of this. One is, hey, it's an honest mistake that resulted in something terrible. The other is we were looking for a casus belli, we were looking for a reason to go to war, and this provided it. So what happens is the U.S. claims that a ship is fired on off the North Vietnamese coast, and Congress grants Johnson war powers. We don't explicitly declare war against Vietnam, but nonetheless, the war against Vietnam has started. We are going to bomb the North Vietnamese incessantly from planes and aircraft carriers from here on out. And we will also largely increase the number of troops in Vietnam. We are not going to rely on ARVN here. We are not going to rely just on our military advisors that Eisenhower Kennedy had sent in. We are sending in the U.S. Army. And what we will send the U.S. Army into is mountainous jungle terrain. It's nearly impassable. There are a few cities in Vietnam, but for the most part, as you can see on this map, Vietnam's got a couple cities. Everything you don't see here, this is not like, the east coast of the United States where it's like suburbs in all of these areas. The spots you don't see with a city on them are jungles and sort of swampy paddies for growing rice. As a result, the North Vietnamese, who are used to living in deprived areas and live a relatively rural life, don't have a problem with this. But the Americans, who are a technical war-fighting machine, are not really prepared for this. And because they are a machine, you get a little grit in there and things don't work as well. And this goes down from this big analogy I'm using to being a very literal thing. The M16 rifle that the Americans are going to use here tends to get very dirty very quickly and requires a lot of maintenance to ensure that it works, which is a bad thing when you have U.S. troops patrolling large sections of jungle from Littleville to Littleville, these little towns in Vietnam. So not only is there all that tension of we could be attacked by the NVA or the Viet Cong at any moment, who are better at jungle fighting than we are, but also, they're fighting against the environment itself. Is kind of like the end of the Korean War, is we're holding out on hills and saying that, well, if we control this hill, we control the area around it. What that results in, we don't really know, but it's an objective that the U.S. has, and that's how we're used to fighting the war. The Viet Cong don't only use the jungle, they dig massive systems of tunnels that go all throughout the country, and they're able to very easily sneak attack the U.S. in a number of places. So again, it's not only the people that we're fighting against and a mentality that we're fighting against, it's the land itself, it's hostile terrain that we're fighting against here. The U.S. is going to use helicopters here for the first time in large amounts. We are going to fly, 6-8 troops in on these Bell UH-1 Huey helicopters, and we'll drop them off, and then we'll go pick them up when their mission is done. Which means we're fighting a very sort of dispersed war here. These are not the massive troop actions that we saw, at the Chosin Reservoir in the Korean War, or, the landings of D-Day in World War II. This is something completely different, and we're not particularly well trained for it. On top of this, as we talked about, the Ho Chi Minh Trail, which is right here, is giving supplies to the Viet Cong all throughout all of Vietnam, not just North Vietnam, but into South Vietnam as well. And it's not just supplies, it's technology and it's fighters. And this Ho Chi Minh Trail becomes a giant thorn in the U.S. side because, this is where the problem arises, it doesn't just go through Vietnam. As you noticed on that map a little while ago, it also goes through Laos and Cambodia, the two countries that are next to Vietnam, largely with the blessing of their government, or at least those governments aren't really trying to stop it. And the U.S. decides, we can't allow that to happen. And so what we're going to start doing is we're going to start bombing the Ho Chi Minh Trail. We're going to start sending troops, kind of illegally here. Well, no, kind of. It was at first. Into Laos and Cambodia to fight against the North Vietnamese troops and the Viet Cong in other countries as well. In 1965, we fight a battle called Ia Drang. If you've seen the movie We Were Soldiers with Mel Gibson, that's the battle this is about. And this really is sort of the prototype for the entirety of the Vietnam War. The U.S. military has the technology, we have the skills, we have the training to fight and win. We have helicopters, we have planes that can drop bombs, we have the best weapons out there, with the exception of our rifles. The AK-47s used by the Vietnamese are probably better than our M16s, but that's neither here nor there for this class. But the NVA has the men and the will. The U.S. basically holds the ground at the end of this. We lose a number of troops, but the Vietnamese lose about 3 times as many. But here's the thing, and this is what's going to keep happening throughout the Vietnam War. The North Vietnamese just keep on coming. They don't differentiate between those French colonists that they beat at the Battle of Dien Bien Phu and the Americans that are here now. They're people that are in their country and they want them out. And so they're going to keep fighting and keep fighting and keep fighting. And that is sort of the thing that we get out of Ia Drang, is that President Johnson looks at this and says, well, I guess what this means is we need to send more troops in so we can just keep winning. But winning there has to be in quotation marks. And we're going to see this again in 1968. This is going to happen towards the end of the year, well, kind of the middle of the year, but the end of Johnson's presidency. Remember, 1968 is a bad year at home. Part of that reason is what happens in Vietnam. Tet is the Vietnamese New Year. It's sort of like a holy festival, and usually nothing happens there. If you have seen the movie Full Metal Jacket, the second half of it takes place during the Tet Offensive here. And what this is a massive coordinated attack from the NVA and the Viet Cong that strikes specifically at U.S. and ARVN troops all throughout the South. The U.S. is unprepared. We did not think this was coming. We are caught with our pants down, if you will. And eventually, after weeks and months of fighting in some places, we eventually win the Tet Offensive. And that those quotes are there for a reason. We are caught unprepared. Our intelligence does not work here. And as a result, we are going to get a lot of bad press out of this. One of the big issues of bad press, and this is another picture I didn't put in, is the execution of a Viet Cong fighter by a police chief. You've seen the picture before. He's shooting him in the head. And it makes it back to the U.S. without context. The context is that earlier that week, the police chief's entire family had been killed by the Viet Cong, and this guy was a known member of the Viet Cong, which is why he was executed on the spot. But that distinction does not make it into the U.S. Instead, we're seeing, our allies not, valiantly fighting like American troops are, helping each other out during a sneak attack, but instead, executing people on the spot, which is something that America associated with the SS in World War II, not our allies. Acts of heroism throughout the Tet Offensive. The U.S. Military does itself proud here, but they're going to suffer 45,000 casualties. Remember, again, casualties is killed and injured. It's not just killed. But this is massive. And in an election year. And the entire country is aghast at this. 1968 is the worst year for the war for America. The vast majority, not the vast majority, but a good chunk of all casualties that are going to happen during Vietnam are going to happen in 1968. At the same time, there's a battle in a city called Hue. I believe there's a new miniseries directed by Ridley Scott about this coming out soon, actually, written by the guy who wrote Black Hawk Down. Hue is besieged. The U.S. Marines are there. They hold out against the Viet Cong and eventually defeat them. And again, we go back to this thing that we just talked about with Ia Drang, is that America continues to win the battles, but they're losing the war, because while America has these pockets of cities that they control and these airfields and military bases and the occasional hills that they control to fire artillery from, the rest of the country is in some degree under the control of the North Vietnamese or the Viet Cong. Be that just, emotionally, as we agree with the communists, or in the literal sense that it is occupied by troops there. Um, as a result of the Tet Offensive, and despite, the victories seen at Hue and other places, protests at home ramp up. 1967, 1968 is going to be really the birth of the major anti-war movement, um, and the unpopularity of the war is going to skyrocket as the death toll rises. The draft is not in effect yet. These are still volunteers in the U.S. Army going out to fight here. And then the next hammer is going to fall on U.S. morale here, and that is the My Lai massacre. Again, not something I really wanted to put pictures of. In southern Vietnam, a number of U.S. troops under the command, for our purposes here, of a guy named Lieutenant Calley, go into a town in Vietnam in South Vietnam that they believed was under the control and harboring the Viet Cong, and they proceed to murder, and I do mean murder, 300 to 500 civilians. The estimates vary because by the time it's investigated, the bodies are in various states of decomposition. A number of them are saved by a U.S. Army pilot who repeatedly flies his helicopter in between the civilians that are being attacked by his own troops. The war crime is reported. Pictures are taken. Charges are leveled at the officers. Lieutenant Calley is convicted. He will eventually be pardoned by President Nixon. The war is not just happening in the South, though. The U.S. is making regular incursions into the North to attack up here. But a lot of the war is being fought down here in South Vietnam. And one of the things that the U.S. is doing is here's your Gulf of Tonkin right here, by the way. They're flying planes and they're bombing Hanoi. And when U.S. troops are shot down, especially aviators are taken to a place that is called the Hanoi Hilton, which is the prison that U.S. pilots are held in. They're tortured. They're held there for years at a time. They're starved. Fingers are broken. You name the horrible thing, it happens to them. One of whom is future U.S. Senator and presidential candidate John McCain. He is held at the Hanoi Hilton for a number of years before eventually being released. Sort of final straw here, or at least the thing that convinces a number of Americans that were sort of on the fence about the war, is the reporting in 1968 by America's most trusted newsman by far. We don't have this person anymore. There is no most trusted newsman in America, but Walter Cronkite was the news. He was the living embodiment. He was the avatar of the news and trustworthiness. And he presented everything really without editorial, and that's the way it was. And in 1968, Cronkite visited Vietnam and is essentially convinced by what he sees that we can't win, and comes back and speaks on it during the national news and basically says, I don't see why we're doing this. Everything has gone so poorly, he says roughly, that we're past the point where we can find the silver lining on this dark cloud. And America is sort of taken aback and says, wow, if Walter Cronkite is coming out and saying this, then it's even worse than we thought. Richard Nixon wins the 1968 presidential election after promising to sort of end the war, but rather than immediately pull out U.S. troops, he institutes a draft lottery, the first one we've seen in years. So in 1969, Nixon begins the draft of 2.2 million troops over the next 6-ish years. Realistically, the draft is going to end in 1973, but some people that are drafted early on are going to stick around. But 2.2 million troops will be drafted into the war. Americans that don't want to fight, these are largely teens, young men between the age of 18 and 23, roughly. They're going to serve 1 year in Vietnam, and then they will be allowed to leave and be replaced. A number of them burn their draft cards in protest. Draft dodgers, as they're referred to, avoid service. A number flee to Canada. America gets more polarized between the people that had, fought in, mainly these kids' parents, who had fought in World War II or in Korea and see this as a patriotic duty, versus that more sort of counterculture group that we've heard about in the last couple weeks, who don't believe in the reason for Vietnam. Um, and the country is going to get more and more polarized by this. Muhammad Ali is going to declare that he uh, can't fight in Vietnam. It goes against his religion. He has nothing against the Vietnamese. And he will be stripped of all of his titles and almost sent to prison. He's going to have to appeal it up to the Supreme Court before he's allowed to get out of it. Um, and he's going to lose a ton of his popularity and some of his prime years in the process of doing this. Um, and America continues to roil over this. One of the other effects of the draft is because they're only fighting for a year, is it starts to be seen that in the last month or two that these U.S. troops are over there, they become far less willing to fight because they're like, hey, I've only got 54 days left in Vietnam. I'm not going to go out and do anything stupid, which drastically reduces the efficiency and the efficacy of U.S. troops over there, because everybody who's been drafted, for the most part, is counting down until they get to leave, as opposed to they're out of a sense of patriotic duty to America or to fight against communism, like we saw, fighting against the Nazis in World War II, fighting against the commies in North Korea. And Nixon has all of this as part of a plan he calls Vietnamization. It's a goofy term, but it's a very important term. And Nixon's plan for Vietnamization is he's going to end the war. He's going to do, except well this time, what Eisenhower and Kennedy tried to do, which is get ARVN ready to fight on their own, get those South Vietnamese ready to fight on their own, and the U.S. will start pulling its troops out of Vietnam as a result. So we're going to send a big wave of troops in with the draft, and we are going to train up the ARVN troops there. Remember, the unreliable ARVN troops. And then they'll be ready to fight against the North Vietnamese instead, and we can go home, and we won't have lost the war. But the ARVN troops are still useless, and as a result, we have now sent over more troops there. We have more troops in more places, and they're fighting against more NVA and Viet Cong troops. So it does not go as planned. In 1970, protests at Kent State University in Ohio result in the shooting deaths of 4 students by National Guard troops with itchy trigger fingers. Nobody really knows how it started. Some claim that a shot was fired by the protesters. Others say that the guards felt attacked and they had rocks thrown at them. But this becomes this image is symbolic of sort of the anti-war movement and the government's, let's say, over-aggressive movements against protesters. Really starting at the end of the Johnson administration and going up through basically the end of the Nixon administration in 1973, we have the Paris peace talks going on. Richard Nixon's Secretary of State, Henry Kissinger, is negotiating with North Vietnamese representatives. Kissinger's actually going to win a Nobel Prize for this. These talks go on for years because the North Vietnamese see themselves as basically winning this war, and if they can just grind the U.S. down. So the North Vietnamese are delaying, much like what we saw with the North Koreans doing, actually. And the U.S. is like, let us do something. And North Korea or North Vietnam here keeps saying, well, you got to remove all of those generals and hold free elections in South Vietnam. And the U.S. is like, we can't do that. We can't betray our allies like that. So there's a lot of circular talk in years in Paris back and forth between Kissinger and the North Vietnamese representatives. Kissinger will accept the Nobel Prize. The North Vietnamese representative will not. But peace talks are going on all this time, but nothing is really coming of it. The war is still happening. Eventually, we are going to expand the war into Laos and Cambodia. The Ho Chi Minh Trail, because it's going through those countries, is going to finally tip Nixon into saying, all right, let's do this. As Johnson was doing it under the table before, illegally, and lying about it, Nixon's just like, fine, let's do it. So we start bombing the trail. We send in U.S. troops to invade portions of those countries the next year. And now the question in America becomes, what's the point of this? Why are we doing this? Are we trying to get entrenched in wars in 2 more countries? This is going to have a massive ripple effect. The Laotian government is going to be destabilized. The Cambodian government is going to be destabilized to the point where they will be taken over by a guy named Pol Pot, who is the hardest of the hardcore communists. He'll take over the country and will end up murdering over 2 million of his own citizens in the following years, because he thinks that they are capitalists and they cannot be converted to communism, so they need to be killed. People with glasses are being killed because it was a sign of having an education. It results in an area of Cambodia literally being called the killing fields, because Pol Pot was taking his fellow Cambodians out there and his military was murdering them by the tens of thousands. It is a nightmare and one of the sort of ripple effects of the Vietnam War you don't hear about very much. On top of this, the protests continue to escalate. From the 1960s through the end of the war, there are protests where tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of people are going to show up. In 1969, there's a moratorium march in Washington where upwards of 250,000 people show up and protest against the war. These protests are going to continue throughout the war, but this is just the start. If you've seen Forrest Gump, that is one of those protests right there. There are numbers of them. It is a major social movement at this point. So how do we end the war? The war starts to end, if you want to think of it, with that Walter Cronkite report that, hey, there is no silver lining here. And it's going to be exacerbated in 1971 by the leak of the Pentagon Papers. Long story short here, what happens is the RAND Corporation, which is a government think tank, these are experts, mathematicians, statisticians that are paid by the government to analyze data and make suggestions. They have basically all of the information that was recorded and put together by the Johnson administration, really from 1965, right after the Gulf of Tonkin resolution gave Johnson the ability to send more troops into Vietnam, up through the end of his presidency in 1968. So 3 years worth of papers that basically show, hey, Johnson illegally sent troops into Laos and Cambodia. He lied about it to Congress. He lied about it to the American people. They fudged the numbers, saying how many civilians were being killed, how many Vietnamese were being killed in the Vietnamese military, and basically that Johnson had manipulated all of the facts during his years in the presidency. So what happens is they're called the Pentagon Papers because the Pentagon sues the Washington Post and the New York Times, who are producing these. They were linked by a member of the RAND Corporation who thought this information needed to get out. But the newspapers start putting these into print. And the government steps in, Nixon steps in and says, whoa, 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 you can't print this. It's damaging to national security. And it makes it to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court basically says, no, it's not. It's not damaging to national security because all of this stuff already happened. The only thing this is damaging is the legitimacy of the American government. And so you have to print it. So thousands of pages of these Pentagon Papers come out, and America starts to think, good Lord, not only is this bad, but we've been lied to about how bad it is. And that is really going to sit poorly with a number of Americans. On top of this, you have events like Jane Fonda right here, referred to as Hanoi Jane. She's a popular actress. Her dad, Henry Fonda, her brother's Peter Fonda, kind of Hollywood royalty. She goes to Hanoi in North Vietnam and endorses the communist government and makes the U.S. look really bad. And I'm still surprised to this day that she was not tried for giving comfort to the enemy and, thrown in jail afterwards. I mean, she literally right here, this device next to her, you can see is an anti-aircraft gun. Remember, this is in Hanoi. This is maybe the aircraft gun that, shoots down a plane that lands Americans in the Hanoi Hilton to be tortured for years on end, like John McCain, until they're exchanged. That's how bad this has gotten, is that she is not being met with just universal vitriol in America. I'm at a loss for words here. I think this is similar to seeing, I don't know, Jennifer Lawrence going out and hanging out with ISIS. It's the same thing. It is a number of people that, we have been at war with for years, and her saying, well, they're not so bad, and, the U.S. has done some terrible stuff, so as a result, this is fine. That's how this hit back then. It's disturbing. The 26th Amendment will pass in 1971. The 26th Amendment gives 18-year-olds the right to vote. The draft that Nixon started made them eligible to go to war. That's what it says under this picture here. Sorry. And the sort of campaign to allow 18-year-olds to vote was that if you're old enough to go get drafted to fight and die for your country, then you should be old enough to vote and vote for the president who will choose whether or not to institute the draft. So that is why when you turn 18, you get to vote. It used to be by state, and usually, in your early 20s, you'd get to vote. The 26th Amendment changes that in 1971 to giving 18-year-olds the right to vote as they are busy fighting for their country. 2.2 million, remember, have been drafted. In 1973, Richard Nixon is going to end the draft. He's going to wind down U.S. involvement. The Paris peace talks are going along well, relatively speaking, and he's about to be in some hot water with Watergate. And he's like, you know what? We're done. It's not popular. Vietnamization has been largely a failure. He doesn't come out and say that, but that is certainly the implication here. And it's time to bring our troops home. If South Vietnam can't hold out on its own, then that's South Vietnam's problem at this point. We'll do what we can, but that's it. So the Paris Peace Accords are finally signed between Kissinger and the North Vietnamese representative in 1973. We're going to pull our troops out. The vast majority of the country, as you can see on this map, everything that is red is controlled by the North Vietnamese. So everything over here controlled from Laos and Cambodia. These little circles here are pockets that are controlled by the U.S. As you can see, by the time the war is ending, the country is virtually under the control of the North Vietnamese anyway. So we are going to hold on to some cities. We'll leave a couple advisors there. The few ARVN troops that are capable are going to continue to fight against the North Vietnamese, but Nixon and America realized that this is only a matter of time. By 1975, Saigon, the capital in the south, which will be later renamed Ho Chi Minh City, is going to fall. The North Vietnamese come in. The U.S. evacuates its final offices, its embassy in Saigon. You've probably seen this picture before. We were landing helicopters on the roof and taking them out to sea to various aircraft carriers to take people. The U.S. staff gets out, but thousands of Vietnamese who'd worked with us for years are left to be captured by the NVA and the Viet Cong just because we don't have the time or the ability to get them out. This is not to say the U.S. doesn't try. We're literally pushing helicopters off the decks of these carriers to make room for more people to get onto the carriers. It's kind of amazing. There's a very good American Experience on the fall of Saigon if you're interested in it that I think you can find either on the American Experience website and maybe on Amazon Prime and YouTube as well. But this is it. This is sort of the final image of the Vietnam War, is Americans racing to get out of the last place we can. Those that don't escape, those South Vietnamese that were our allies, are quote-unquote re-educated. A number of them are executed. The rest are basically tortured and brainwashed into agreeing with the new government that is installed. Ho Chi Minh had died a couple years earlier, and his other folks had taken over. By the end of the Vietnam War in 1975, America is done with international involvement. 58,318 U.S. troops have been killed. There's your death toll by year. We talked about how bad 1968 is. There you go. 67, 68, 69 are the worst of it. You can see by the time the draft goes into effect, we are winding down our offensive operations there anyway. But Americans are still being killed. Another 153,000 U.S. troops are wounded. 1,500 are missing in action, including 200 that are never accounted for. Most POWs are sent home towards the end of the war, including John McCain. But America's done. We have been beaten and embarrassed by a country of uneducated farmers on the other side of the world. It's cost us lives, it's cost us treasure, it's cost us a lot of our international credibility, and we're done. And going forward, America is going to sort of turn in on itself and not really try to be the world's policeman again, except for, a blip in the 80s, a blip in the 90s, and then it's going to take 9/11 to really pull us out of that shell again. The Vietnam War Memorial is erected in 1982 between the Lincoln and Washington memorials on the National Mall near the reflecting pool. where a number of Vietnam protests had happened in the past, and contains the name of everybody who fought for the U.S. and was killed in the Vietnam War. And that's where this ends. Next week, we will pick up with the 70s into the 80s and sort of seeing what America does as the war winds down on the home front, and the blowback from the tragedy, I guess you could call it, of the Vietnam War. So, ladies and gentlemen, I realize this was a bummer, but that's it. All right. Go ahead, look over your notes, and then take that quiz.